it is Business Monday. I want to thank our friends at Deepwater Wind for their sponsorship. And we got a lot of news. First of all, we got to give you credit. Your Florida State team, Seminoles, is in the Sweet 16. Neither Providence College or the University of Rhode Island was able to fight their way that far. And you're a little more of a football school than a basketball school, so you take great pride in this, I understand.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And Charlie Ward, you're
Charlie Ward, Dave Cowens. Remember Dave Cowens of the Celtics?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Seminole.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of Seminoles playing basketball, but there's so many Seminoles playing football, sometimes they get overshadowed.
Do you get a percentage of everything they all earned as the money man?
When I get my bill from the Alumni Association, the percentage goes the other way.
Let's see. Let's talk about a few things today. First and foremost is jobs numbers came out. First, we had a month ago's job numbers in Rhode Island, and the numbers were down 200 just for the month. Not a big number, but then shortly thereafter, a major employer, one of the largest employers, and down at Quonset, announced that they were closing. Depending on which number you want to use, somewhere between 200 and 400 workers at a place, and those jobs are gone. This is not a phase down to try and recalibrate. These jobs are gone. The $33 million facility built down there is being abandoned. It gets turned over to Quonset, according to talking to folks there. The next month's numbers came out nationally, and the U.S. economy added 313,000 jobs. What's the disconnect?
Well, I tried not to look at it on a month-to-month basis because there's a lot of, things happen in 1 month.
But and they get corrected.
And they get corrected, yeah. So we've been running numbers at the Hassenfeld Institute on how well the state has been doing in creating jobs, since January 15th, which coincidentally is the time that we get a new administration in the state of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
And what we find out, while there are pluses and minuses, our rate of employment growth has been about 3% over that time. We've grown our employment by 3%. The country as a whole has grown by 5%. Massachusetts is close to the national average. I don't recall what it was, but it's about 4.5%. So when you step back and look at it over a long period of time, we're just not growing jobs as quickly as other people. Now there are hits and misses. Some months are better, some months are worse. But as I said, you have to look at it over time, and then you have to ask the question: okay, why? What's the problem? And one thing I think is fair to say, regardless of who is in office, governors get too much credit when the economy is booming, and too much blame when it's not going well. And the objective of leadership from a governor, from a state on economic development is to invest, try to achieve balance, but understand what you're investing in and what the long-term strategy has to be. And so there are a couple of things that I think are creating this problem for the state, and not all the fault of the political system. A lot of the job growth and economic performance is baked into the cake. And we'll just talk about this. Our demographics. We will have more people in the state of Rhode Island in the year 2005. We had about 1.06 million. Then we're going to have about the same number in 2040. But there's almost no employment.
It's really remarkable, isn't it? I mean, that the state is so stagnant. There's almost not a state in the country that's as stagnant as we are.
Well, it's not in the stagnation, because you'd have minuses, Governor, and you could not turn things to gold unless you're growing people. But it's not only that we're not growing people. If you look inside those numbers, we're getting grayer. A larger percentage of our population is not working age. There are people over 65. Our working age population is declining. Our labor force growth is slow compared to the rest of the country. So there's really a demographic challenge built in, and so the issue becomes, what can government do to reverse that demographic challenge? We're also, in some ways, becoming poorer and not taking on the policy challenges to change that. Education is a great example. If you look at education, the legacy of failing urban schools, continues. And with all the lip service and with the additional investment we're making in and really bringing in some good people, I think Providence has better leadership now than they've had for some time in running their schools. You look, only 44% of whites are proficient in English language arts, compared to half of that, 22% for African Americans and Hispanics. The same is true in math. 40% of the whites are proficient, which is not a number to write home about,
Yeah.
but it's 16% for African Americans and Hispanics. And you can't.
And you've got some major high schools in Providence that are in the single digits for proficiency. Single digits, less than 10%.
And on the other hand, you have some schools in Providence and some of the urban core that are really showing marked improvement. But the point being is you can't have zero population growth, or roughly zero population growth. The population churning you have is reducing the size of the workforce and having more elderly people, and then the people who are going to be your future workforce who live in urban areas, because Providence County is growing as well, maybe not as quickly as Washington County, but it's growing pretty quickly compared to some of the other counties, have failing schools, have kids on average in those schools, and these are mostly minority schools, who have 16-17% proficiency in math, 22% proficiency in English. You can't build an economy around those numbers.
Let's go back to a key thing you said. Governors don't deserve the blame and don't deserve
as much blame.
As much blame and as much credit maybe as they. But Governor Chafee, when he had his inaugural address, it was widely panned.
Which Governor Chafee?
Lincoln Chafee in 2010 gave a speech about the need to pass gay rights, and that in and of itself was a civil rights issue as well as an economic development issue. It was a very different kind of speech. But in 2014, 2015, when Governor Raimondo came in, her speech was about economic growth. So she took that on as her challenge. And I would say, most of the narrative that comes out of that office is about economic development issues. It seems to be the key focus of what her administration has focused on. It's had a huge investment, a couple $100 million in all the types of incentives that have been invested into. Is it unfair though to hold them?
No, because the question you're asking is really a cost-benefit question.
Sure.
And so for the amount of attention and the amount of money that we're spending on economic development, are we getting a decent return on investment? And that's the political question that you can hold any governor accountable for. In North Carolina, when governor and dreamed of the Research Triangle, for years they had 15,000, 20,000 people working in it.
Right.
But it took off eventually, and it's been a great boom to the state. So you got to be careful not to judge the investment premature, because these things take time. But what you look at this administration, it's not tens of millions, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that we're investing in economic development. And I've argued, and people can disagree and certainly respect that disagreement, that a disproportionate amount of the investment is company specific, not structural. So when you're putting taxpayer money or giving subsidies or giving tax write-offs for people to build apartment houses and hotels, it's hard to see how that translates into making the kind of structural changes in the economy that you need to make. In education, this administration and this Board of Education have well understand the problem. They've dealt with English as a second language. They've dealt with getting computers into schools. Those are the right issues. They've dealt with articulation between high school and between colleges. But when you step back, you get hit the face by two things. Where's the focus? Are any of these programs being supported at scale?
But let me play devil's advocate for a moment. This governor says, "Hey, listen, I'm going to invest in some of the best companies in the world. Johnson & Johnson." When she invested in GE, it was considered one of the best companies in the world.
I hope she didn't buy much of their stock. It's down a little bit.
It is down to about $14, $13 a share with the markets repelling today. Infosys, whatever you think of Infosys, but a slew of companies that, and maybe the bet was, hey, listen, we're going to invest in a group of companies, and there's a good chance one of them will really sink their roots into Rhode Island and go from being 50 to 100 jobs or 100 to 200 jobs, and might be a 2,000 or a 5,000 job company. Is that a wrong strategy, or is that because previous governors have said, you know, the jewelry district, it was gonna be this and that,
Yeah,
and it never was. 195, and in fairness to her, 195 has been a 20-year project without a single tenant until this deal with Wexford, whatever you think of the deal with Wexford. But there's been nothing there since that project began 20 years ago. So is she completely wrong in that, or should it have been, listen, we're here, our workforce is not trained well enough, we need to have taken that $200 million and put it into schools?
It's all of the above. The question is, in public policy, is how do you, split the pie up? There's balance. And it would seem to me that we, as I said a minute ago, we put a disproportionate amount of the money into tax incentives, corporate welfare, if I can use that term, while recognizing the other problems, but I think not investing enough in those other programs. So it's never a black or white issue. Every state has tax incentives. We're going to use tax incentives. But tax incentives for 4 or 5 hotels, tax incentives to have cranes, I call them political cranes in the sky, to build, apartment houses, that is really the question. Would the money better have been spent in investing in infrastructure or schools, or making government more effective, or making, if government can spend making smart cities and turning innovation around much quicker than we do. Those are the kinds of questions where the administration, recognizes the need, makes some initial investment, but it's never at scale. And I argue that we should use tax incentives. Some tax incentives have been very wisely used. I think the qualified jobs credit is a good example of a helpful tax credit.
Yeah.
But some of the Rebuild Rhode Island and some of the others are competing, with monies that might be better off making structural change. And structural change doesn't have to come in terms of increased spending. What can we do to reduce the cost of doing business? What can we do, looking out of your studio here in Providence at 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon and not saying much?
Nope.
One easy answer, expensive, is what if you got rid of the tangible tax on personal property? That cost a lot of money, have to be phased in over a period of time like we did in getting rid of the inventory tax. But that would be an investment in small business, that every small business and medium-sized business benefited from, to more. And by the...
Let's talk about this for a second. Clearly, based on the public polling that's come out, whether it was the polling we did or polling you've done or polling by others, that the governor's strategy on economic development has not captured the public's approval at a particularly high rate. She's at in the low 40s of an approval rate. She's in the low 40s on, is the state moving in the right direction?
That's high 30s.
High 30s, and that's been fairly consistent across much of the public polling. I think we were in the low 40s on John Delavope's poll in October. Are you seeing anything coming from any of the other gubernatorial candidates or the General Assembly or any other thought leaders in Rhode Island that is piercing, that is attractive to you, that says, boy, there's a big vision of how to move Rhode Island forward? And it's early still.
Yeah, I see some ideological differences. I hear some of the gubernatorial candidates, talking about, less crony capitalism and investing in other things. But no one's put out enough specifics yet to answer that question. Legislature's very interesting point you bring up. Years ago, the legislature had a committee or an ad hoc group on economic development. I'm not quite sure how they do their job in evaluating the performance of places they funded. So I have argued for a long time that legislature gave Governor carte blanche practically in creating Commerce Rhode Island. Commerce Rhode Island is now 3 years old. What's the legislature done to say, okay, are we getting a return on investment? How quickly is that return coming? Who is doing a mega performance audit? So, I think the legislature, it's not the governor, it's the legislature, it's the governor, it's the leadership, really gets stuck in a kind of rut. This is going to be our economic development policy, and it produces some good, produces some things that may need a course correction, and you don't hear much about the course correction. Memory seems to be short sometimes.
Yeah. Should the legislature have a standing committee on economic development? Are we at a point now where that's really the kind of dialogue that should be, and should it be more of a co-equal branch of government? It seems to be, hey, listen, if it's not a home run, we're going to look at it at budget time, but There's not a lot else as it relates to oversight.
Well,
We kind of use only House oversight. There's no Senate oversight committee. Only House oversight when things completely go off the rail, DCYF and things like that.
Well, I think you have to define what the legislative responsibility is. I have great trepidation of having the legislature get too involved and then be making deals with their buddies for, tax incentives and different kinds of projects. So I think that's an executive responsibility. We've created semi-quasi-public agencies to handle that. You do want to depoliticize that to some extent, but there's an area where they are dropping the ball, and this is what their responsibility is oversight. Their responsibility is policy and direction. So short of getting involved in deal making, which
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting deal making, but I'm saying on a regular basis,
Oh, yeah.
not in a only when the project doesn't work for 3 years. That every year, or even more often than every year, that there's a real analysis and an audit of rebuild Rhode Island dollars, or these
Absolutely.
dollars, or those dollars,
and even, yes, of course.
and look at an ROI.
Of course, and you need to staff that committee up. You need to have professional competence to do the evaluation. When a group like Commerce Rhode Island comes in and said, we want to rebuild Rhode Island, the question the legislature should be asked, okay, fine, we're gonna give you $50 million, they give you authority for $50 million or whatever the numbers
Sure.
in tax credits. What percentage is for manufacturing? What percentage is for construction? What percentage is for, areas where we think there's a particular, potential? And that's where they are dropping the ball, because instead of having, some targets up front, some meaningful goals and metrics, you don't have these meaningful goals and metrics, so all the deals get thrown together. Some are good deals, some are bad deals.
But isn't that the nature of deals? If you go and look
No.
at a private equity group or venture capital group.
It's the nature of a deal within a cohort. So if you felt that you needed to invest X in manufacturing, you might have good deals or bad deals in manufacturing.
Well, let's just go to GE. GE was about 2 years ago when they announced they were leaving Connecticut. Jeff Immelt was, one of the leading CEOs in the country. Spoke up at graduation at Bryant University, and we peeled the proverbial onion back, and those things weren't quite as rosy. The second jet, chasing the first jet, was a little more costly than one assumed. Massive pension underfunding at GE. They're having to restate financials for years. Listen, you read Forbes and Fortune, and GE looked like as big a win as you could ever get in the history of business.
Well, you raise a question I think has to be discussed at two levels. One, when is it appropriate for government to pick winners and losers?
Yeah.
And, generally it's not appropriate. Generally, every time a government picks winners and losers, you're gonna lose 70% of the time and win 30% of the time. So you might as well, recognize that. But having, said that, the state did nothing, wrong in trying to recruit that brand to the state.
Sure.
When you do that, there are risks. The risks are very evident now with General Electric. General Electric is a very different company today than it was when we made that investment, but we didn't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
So, it's easy to sit here and second
So,
guess a
so is the
decision.
better strategy just create a better environment? Forget the deals and just get the tax rates as low as possible, train the workforce as high as possible, and let the invisible hand take place.
Well, you can't, the invisible hand, I'd love to say that's gonna happen, but the difference is where we start and where we finish. And you really need to start with better schools, you need to start with reducing the cost of doing business. The Mercatus, Center at George Mason University does a ranking each year of the fiscal responsibilities.
Yeah, we don't come out so well on that one.
Well, we came out 38th. We're below average. Neither did Massachusetts come out very well by that measure. But those are the first things that need to be fixed. And then the second thing that needs to be fixed is recognizing the reality that we do compete. We do compete with other states, and there's no such thing as unilateral disarmament. What we've done is we've had a guns and butter strategy. But we've been very little butter and mostly guns, and we haven't seen the return on investment that you would think you would see.
Let's jump over to one other issue before you go, and then Neil Steinberg from Rhode Island Foundation's on. Let's talk about a great fanfare. It was a 10, 20-year odyssey to get rid of the regressive tax on automobiles, right? So there was this regressive tax that hit the poorest people who had the least valuable cars, who lived in the urban corridor, who were paying oftentimes on an annual basis as much as the car was worth. So finally, through the doggedness of Speaker Mattiello, the regressive car tax was repealed. And it is now replaced in the city of Providence with traffic cameras, which are whacking people at the tune of $1 million a month. It looks like at the end of this month, right about now to the end of the month, it will have exceeded 20,000 tickets. 5 more cameras were turned on this weekend, and the young mayor of Providence, Jorge Elorza, says upward and onward, this is great public policy. What are your thoughts about a traffic camera structure that seems to have little to do with the speed around school zones, because most of them aren't anywhere near a school zone?
I get very concerned when government says we're gonna raise your tobacco taxes so you stop smoking.
Right.
And we're gonna increase, fines, motor vehicle fines for safety. So they've really mixed up, whether this is for safety or whether this is to raise revenue. And that's very unsettling. The second issue, and this is the problem of technology, there has to be common sense in the application. There's if you're gonna use innovation and robots, for traffic enforcement, that's the driverless cars are in the future. That's in the future, but to use it the way it's been applied, really raises questions about the process the city is going through.
It's interesting. We did a story last week talking to some folks. Len Ladaro was one of them, and a couple others, about really this is a danger zone for Providence with regards to bringing people in for events, shows, dinner up on Federal Hill, etc. Because the person who lives out in Coventry or East Greenwich or Cumberland says, I don't know where these cameras are. I don't want any part of a $95 20-mile. There's one up the street from. Drive 20 miles an hour. This is nowhere near school. It's not within. It's within a quarter mile of a school. That's a long way. 20 miles an hour. You may get killed from the car behind you more than you are as a danger.
I got to tell you a Tennessee story about that. I used to live in a town called Smyrna, Tennessee. Smyrna was outside of
Smyrna.
Smyrna. Like
Smyrna.
In Syria, they probably pronounce it differently. But and we had almost no taxes because anyone that went, this is before the interstates, anybody that went from Chicago to Florida had to come through Smyrna.
Right.
And our mayor, who happened to be the adjutant to George Patton during World War II, we had speech raps, and they were used for that reason. And so Smyrna didn't develop as quickly as we'd elected it to develop. There's the public policy issue is pretty clear. Perceptions are important.
Yeah.
But also the parking meters are important. Do people not shop on Thayer Street anymore? Because
Lots of vacancies. Folks up at Federal Hill say it's a huge problem. And who's benefiting? You can't get a restaurant space in Main Street in East Greenwich. That Main Street in East Greenwich used to be void of restaurants not too long ago, virtually. And now it's one of the biggest hotbeds. And those in the know say it's directly tied to people saying, I don't want to deal with the hassle of going into Providence. Parking meters, traffic cameras. There's always going to be crime in an inner city. I think people understand that.
The point you're getting to about the robots and technology and traffic enforcement is somebody in City Hall needs to connect the dots.
Yeah.
And that's not to say there's not a place, for it, but you've got to connect the dots and understand the unintended consequences. And apparently, no one in City Hall really thought very long.
Well, Kobe Dennis was on, who's a candidate for mayor, and he said, listen, it was never tested in one location. All of a sudden, there were 6 of them. They run way beyond what the school zone time periods are. They run till 8 o'clock at night. They run all day on Saturday. There's no correlation between what they claim to be being used for and accordingly. And 5, as I understand it, 5 Providence police officers have been taken off the street. The ultimate irony, been taken off the street to process the tickets. And this is not exactly a well-staffed police force in Providence. I know you've got to go. I know Neil needs to get on. We're going to be back in 1 second. I want to thank the money man, Gary Sasse, for being on Business Monday, and we'll be right back.